Right, so welcome everyone to our weekly call. You'll see that we are now recording. That should tell you on your device, depending on how you've accessed the call. So main topic of conversation today, I'm sort of very pleased to say we got two distinguished guest speakers, Mallory Knodel, as well as no, I've lost him on my screen, which is really poor. I hope he's still here. Bear with me. Oh yes, there you are. Sorry, Shivan. Sorry, for 1 minute I'd lost you, but you've moved on to my second screen. Apologies for that. So we have Mallory and Shivan who have kindly agreed to reprise a presentation that they gave a few weeks back called Privacy Versus, which I saw the presentation. So it raised some interesting issues and I think highlighted some of the trade-offs which some of you will be aware of. So they've kindly agreed to join us and sort of take us through some of that material, and then hopefully that will trigger a discussion, just picking up on some of the previous discussions we've had in this general area. You both, if you wish, you can present slides. You should be able to do that from your either of your devices, and you can sort of mute and unmute at leisure. And what I suggest we do is to sort of run through the presentation, and then we'll move to take questions once you've had a chance to sort of set out the sort of premise of the presentation, if that's okay. So,
sure.
Thanks for coming.
Sorry, did you just want us to speak for a certain amount of time? I wasn't totally sure.
I think that you take it as long as you need, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards. So, I mean, obviously, when I say as long as you need, within reason, but we're not up against the clock. So, please sort of take sufficient to do the presentation justice. And thanks both for making the time to join us today.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. I'll go ahead and introduce myself, and then I'll let Shivan do the same before we jump in. So I'm Mallory Knodel. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the Center for Democracy and Technology based in Washington, D.C. And I've been working in the IRTF and the IETF for some years now. Previously was at other civil society organizations. So I've always sort of represented the public interest, and I'll get into the goals of the paper, but generally speaking, these aren't really new ideas, but they are put together side by side in a way that I think the public interest and civil society would represent these issues. Even though different sectors raise them at different times for different reasons, we wanted to sort of put it all in one place. And so I really appreciate having my co-author, Shivan from Salesforce, who also has worked in the public interest for a long time, but also has taken an approach on his work on privacy, specifically DNS privacy in the IRTF as well. Go ahead, Shivan.
Yeah. Hey all, my name is Shivan, and yeah, I'm a software engineer on the DNS team at Salesforce, and specifically focused on DNS privacy. Currently working on zone transfer over TLS with Sarah Dickinson and Alison Mankin, and yeah, and also have been working with Mallory over the last couple of years, doing stuff related to civil society. And yeah, like Mallory said, like this is kind of like a collection, we try to keep it like a centralized place for having a bunch of discussion essentially about the various trade-offs that we've seen over the last few years around DNS privacy.
Right. So the paper was originally written just again to compile all these different things, but it was also in response to a workshop that happened lately that Shivan was actually the chair for. So also, Shivan, if you want to jump in and talk about the larger goals of that would be fine. But we felt that this paper hasn't a place to live yet. It's a live paper. We're still taking feedback on what's in it. We have a GitHub for it that we can share. And so appreciate very much, Andrew, the invitation to come here and to talk to you all, because this discussion could inform the way that this paper shapes up, which is, to be fair, the intended audience is not necessarily any one particular stakeholder group, but I think that it accurately represents and is understood by a variety of stakeholder interests is important, so that it is, aims to be as rigorous as possible in its analysis. So we've sort of introduced ourselves. I'll go into the goals a little bit more deeply. And then Shivan, if we can stop there, you can talk a little bit about the goals of the workshop and why this that workshop sort of sparked this work. So we want to actually confront tensions. So I've been a public advocate and in civil society for many, many years of the internet. My career started in 2008, which feels like a long time for me, but it's always been the case that privacy creates tensions with other areas of a variety of things that the public interest advocates for, particularly when it's done with a technological tool. And in this case, we're looking at the ways that DNS privacy, not all of the DNS privacy proposals are the same. And so looking at the ways in which DNS privacy has repeated and replayed out some of those tensions and what exactly those tensions are and how they might be resolved. From one of my main interests is, as a advocate, I want others in this, other advocates, other public interest organizations, human rights organizations, and so on, to understand the nuanced tensions, because we've seen a lot of writing from a variety of digital rights or digital human rights organizations talking about the ways that DNS over HTTPS, for example, is very good. But then when they are asked to back those claims up or confronted with tensions from other stakeholder groups, they may not be as well informed. And then, of course, we actually want to try to ease these tensions. Like, there are ways around them. Not all of these DNS privacy solutions are equal. So let's think about the ways in which they can be implemented more carefully, or maybe some are better for the public interest than others. What are those? Can we take a sort of informed approach to that? And that's the fourth thing, which is that we know that there's more needed to understand these different trade-offs. And so the document doesn't necessarily provide that research, but I think it's a good pointer to some research that's needed. I'll pause there. Shivan, if you want to add anything or talk more about the workshop that happened for those that didn't attend.
Yeah, sure. So Sarah, Alice, and I co-chaired a workshop, the DNS privacy workshop, and it was co-hosted with NDSS that happened in February. And so the main topic of the workshop was measuring deployment and effectiveness of encrypted DNS, because in the last I guess especially in the last year, we've seen a bunch of different proposals and work being done to both measure encrypted DNS, but also just new proposals around private DNS. So that's why the workshop was organized. But we've also seen governments get involved governments get involved in like DNS blocking sometimes, or generally regulation. So we had a special entire section on civil society, usability, and DNS, which is where this paper was presented. I've sent a link out on the chat for the workshop, and it has slides and links to the papers as well if people are interested in some of the other ones. And there's also notes that you can see on the left-hand side for all the different subsections.
Yeah, and we also at the end can link to the GitHub where this paper lives, and I think you can also see these slides that you're seeing now. We did get some feedback from that workshop, and since this paper has been out, and I, for one, haven't incorporated all of those yet into a new version of the paper. And that's maybe where, Shivan, you can also help remind me like what has been some of the additions since then, because we do want to give you an update. But these were presented at these slides were presented at that workshop. So, right, getting into the paper itself. We actually look at 4 different areas that and these things have come up in the last couple of years in different spaces and at different times. Again, we're just trying to put them all in one place. So one is the effect of measurement on that DNS privacy's had on measurement. So ways of academic scholarship. There are a variety of things that once you start to sort of make more private or more secure internet protocols, that does sometimes disrupt even benign and in the public interest like internet measurement. So we wanted to acknowledge that. We know that some of the choices that protocol designers have made in terms of how to roll out DNS privacy has an impact on who is actually doing DNS lookup provision and resolving. So that has consolidation concerns. That's probably like our biggest section, I would say, because there's a lot, mostly because just consolidation is generally very bad, and there's a lot to say about that. Abuse mitigation, similar to internet measurement, have a mirror relationship there because it's about detection, typically, abuse over the network, and even into the content layer at times, right? We could put under here, depending on where you fall on this issue, if it's like legitimate, speech, filtering, like that sort of thing, but it makes abuse mitigation harder, straight up. And then the last one that I think was was a newer contribution to the conversation was seeing that there are some sufficiently motivated censors out there that censors with a C and an S, that will actually just shut down networks based on the protocol being used, in particular, like oblivious DOE or encrypted hello, that we have not seen before, and what that implies then for people who are accessing perfectly legitimate content, they're perfectly legitimate uses, but because of the protocol they're using, they're not able to access things. So that was a new one, and I felt like we needed to think about the effects of that in advance. And so that's what we do. So in each section, we sort of break down the problem. We talk about how the different DNS privacy specifically intersects with that problem. One moment, I'm sorry. Sorry. And then we try to then point towards additional research that might help us learn more about that. So this is essentially what I've just told you. I'm going to skip that. Right, so we know that DNS privacy is definitely in the public interest. That's not something that we're debating or disputing. In this paper, we definitely back it up with a couple of high-level observations and documentation about why that is, so that we don't have to do the work of explaining why DNS privacy is important. We take it as a public good. The things that we focus on then is if if privacy on the internet is important, then what can we do about these knock-on effects in other domains? That's really the focus here. So the two things that we lean on, again, because both Shivan and I work in the IETF, IRTF technical space, are one from each, actually. So we don't have to necessarily make the case that privacy is, end user privacy is important. That's been done. We take it as a given. And then the other thing is that we recognize in the ways in which this plays out in the human rights framework, that there are some rights, irrespective of how they play out on the internet, that sometimes are at tension with one another. And I think that is probably best expressed in RFC 8280 that establishes how human rights and protocols interact. And so we can lean on sometimes in the public interest, being able to go back to the place where the tension occurred, which is sort of in the offline society space, but then can sometimes be exacerbated by protocol choice. Just trying to invoke that there. I'll pause if you wanted to say anything here at this point, Shivan.
No, I think that's perfect.
Great. And so, yeah, I don't know if it was explicitly mentioned, but Shivan is co-chairing the privacy research group. I'm chairing the human rights research group. So it was a nice collaboration in that respect. So measurement then, what can we say about measurement here? Obviously, there are some major public interest benefits just being able to hold accountable and to create transparency of network providers, right? So sometimes the measurement is happening in our own homes. Other times, we're hoping that academics and other third-party institutions are helping to monitor network behavior. But this can sometimes, measuring in general, right? Irrespective of how it's done, measurement always has some, there's some bar to, maintaining privacy and consent of people being researched. And then the other thing to consider then is that actually the methodology may not work anymore if everyone is using, encrypted DNS. So, there's a lot of ways in which if the sort of measurement tool, say it's like a browser applet, or it's, something that people have opted into, other things, they actually just, if they start doing private DNS lookup or become an intermediary resolver, then this sort of problem goes away. Actually, it's quite easy. But there certainly are some research methodologies out there that will not work if the majority of traffic they're using, becomes, either sent through HTTPS or TLS or, quick. So what, and then the sub question under that, both of those questions then is there a difference between, putting your private DNS queries at the operating system level over TLS versus doing it in the browser level over HTTPS, and might that then inform the ways in which we want private DNS to be rolled out in terms of preference. The second one, like I said, we might have the most to say about consolidation, is that there's just a whole lot of public interest concerns around this. Obviously, we know that it has that consolidated markets deliver poor services. We see that a lot in the internet provision space, unfortunately. It can be economically detrimental because you have antitrust issues. Users tend to be, less happy over time. Innovation gets slowed. All of these things facilitates mass surveillance, single points of failure, et cetera. It's something to be avoided. And I think we didn't even get an exhausted list here. And taking them point by point also in this context can be helpful in thinking about what might we do in terms of rolling out private DNS to mitigate some of these or avoid them as much as possible. I will say that we recognize that in the case of browsers, for example, because DOE is a really good example of actually leveraging the sort of benefit of a consolidated market, is that then people using Firefox were able to get private DNS lookup with essentially a flip of a switch. It was quite easy. Compared to sort of the bottom-up approaches of lots of other ways protocols are rolled out. So that is one benefit. And I think, again, it's all about trade-off, right? It's also really good to see that there are implementations of DOE that use opportunistic lookup, so that then provides the sort of ecosystem-wide. So it's not just a deep and quick speedy delivery of a private protocol. It's also building an ecosystem out such that that is a protocol that many companies are using and is now somewhat ubiquitous in that way. So it's the breadth versus the depth. So I want to as well continue this sort of the questions that are raised here in consolidation. Again, it might be that this will seed discussion coming up. But yeah, we want to know how the different deployment models have a different effect on consolidation. Some of that's obvious, right? Like opportunistic lookup versus, trusted provider. There's a difference there on how consolidation. Also, though, we did not, I think it's important to actually interrogate the ways that trust is offloaded. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean, anytime a user clicks or makes a decision, or the intermediary makes the decision for them and invokes trust as the reason why, we have to question, is that trust happening between the intermediaries? Is it because, we're sort of transferring the trust relationship, or is the user really the one who's being centered in that and making the choice of what they consider to be trustworthy and whatnot? I think that the thought here around privacy and diversity is always a sort of tension, or like, I said, it can be a tension. There are some examples out there where that is not, like Tor, for example, does a really good job of, creating a privacy enabling thing, but in an incredibly distributed way. In fact, it hinges upon it. So taking that question and flipping it on its head, is there something about the way the DNS works that's going to skew one way or another in terms of its ability to, be both privacy preserving and diverse? So we've seen lots of ways that folks are trying to resolve that with oblivious DNS, for example, like round robining, the resolvers and that sort of thing. But, of course, the DNS itself has some centralization and decentralization aspects to it. Yeah, I think I don't want to just keep reading these questions, but you get the idea of where we're going to it. I think the one thing that we have heard a lot of over the course of the last couple of years about the question of consolidation is that once DNS privacy is ubiquitous, the consolidation concern will go away. And I'm not totally sure that that will be true. I think we often shouldn't be complacent to lean on that as a possibility.
I guess just
yeah, go ahead, John, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that like this kind of tension is, this particular one is not new on the internet, right? Like we saw the HTTPS rollout when a major browser vendor was like, yep, we're going to all switch to HTTPS as of this date. We saw that a bunch of stuff broke on the web, but arguably it was good for adopting encryption overall. So, and yeah, so it is definitely not a new problem, but it is something that crops up every now and then.
Zoom, it's very difficult to find the mute button on Zoom sometimes, sorry. All right, so abuse, like I said, very much parallels some of the same tensions with measurement, just because of the ability to detect. I would say that in my previous role, I worked for a freedom of expression organization. And so I would not necessarily be one of those that would put sort of content filtering into this section, but I do understand some might in the need to have, legitimate services potentially that provide, filtering content. But just the notion that, there is a lot of garbage that goes across the network. And so the need to get all of that out, whether it be spam or just objectionable content or whatever it is like very critical. And as in the public interest, there's a raging debate at all times about freedom of expression versus these sorts of functions. But just to say that there's always going to be a line, of course, it just depends on who you work for and what you think where that line sits. Right. At the end of the day, we really want to encourage freedom of expression and enable it as much as possible, because we know that that line is just so very easy to drag all the way to the end if you're thinking of authoritarian governments, and we often are. So we don't take as a given that any particular government or regulatory environment is not going to be fully authoritarian. And so that's often why we just sort of we're really just concerned about this issue of censorship. But nonetheless, with all that preamble aside, we do think that there are some unintended consequences when, you can't track network activity and you can't mitigate then abusive behavior. So I think that one of the other things that we noticed too is that in efforts to sort of implement all of the tools for DNS privacy and continue to do this mitigation, one thing that was noted in an RFC that is cited in the paper that I can't give you the 4 digits for was just that needing to actually implement and then configure all these things can actually lead to a lot of mistakes. And so it is in the best interest of sort of complicated setups that we all do tend to start converging on some of the best protocols rather than just leave it so open-ended with a variety of different solutions that then end up confusing people and making all of this much, much harder than it has to be. And I think that just the last thing to say, is that one thing that I question or I think about also in the context of when we're talking about like, URL content filtering is using the DNS the best way to do that? It's definitely it used to be the easiest way to do it, but that now that it's changing and you sort of have a bunch of different protocol options for how to do sort of filtering and abuse mitigation, now that they all sort of have their own version of security and privacy embedded in the protocols, maybe there are other ways. Maybe we can go back to thinking about the other options out there and not just sort of continue to use DNS because historically it's been very, very easy to do. So that is a genuine question. And I think we should look for folks who are trying to innovate on that to understand a little bit more. Okay, and then the last one, and I think we'll be done soon. It's about perfect timing, I think half past the hour or 30 minutes in. But the idea around the shutdowns is really, that's the end for us. So in terms of going back to the freedom of expression advocacy, the access to information, the ability to organize online, an internet shutdown violates those rights very, very deeply because there is no sort of liberal approach to doing that. It is throwing all of the babies out with all of the bathwater. And this is not also speculation. Like we see internet shutdowns on a weekly basis now. There are some governments that are so highly motivated that they've actually now incorporated things like TLS 1.3 with the encrypted hello extension completely blocked, nothing in or out that's using that protocol. So it's not speculation. And the reason why we need to bring it up is actually that then rollout of sort of more experimental things actually matters quite a bit then. So going back to the example of encrypted hello, that it does stick out on the network. So even though in its original sort of design aims, it wanted to not do that, as it was sort of rolled out experimentally and perhaps maybe too soon, the sticking out or the header having encrypted, very obviously encrypted content was easy to detect and to filter out. And that is exactly what's happening in China. We need to think these things through in advance so that this doesn't happen, right? So that we aren't now saying that, if you use this sort of very innocuous protocol simply for your DNS lookup, that you're actually putting at risk the people you're communicating with, the network you're on, at risk for like total shutdown. That is the issue. We need to try to head these off at the pass, basically. The other question is, right, like I was saying before under the abuse mitigation is that DNS has typically been a really easy way to block various content. The harder ways include, deep packet inspection, other things, and we need to think through when DNS is no longer the way that is easiest to actually to filter and censor content, what then next? And is that actually worse? And not to say that we shouldn't then, do that, but just to be able to be at least one step ahead, because I think we're often actually a step behind. So I hope that a new edition is clear. I don't think that there's much more to say in terms of the slides though, Shivan, so just interrupt me if you want to jump in with the problem statement side of things. But it does seem that in a lot of cases, when you dig deep, although we'd like to go deeper, that actually just more embracing DNS privacy and actually allowing for it in your system, whether that system is for internet measurement or abuse mitigation, is the right approach, because then again, you'll still be serving traffic. You'll be able to look into it. Hopefully you do it in a way that your users still trust you and you're actually rolling it out in an encrypted way. I think that's not actually an issue, right? Nobody actually is designing protocols such that anyone along the wire can see what everyone else is doing. Like, I don't think anybody's ever advocated for that. And so these are some of the things that we think could point to future work. And also very happy to hear, others' ideas for that. I'm actually going to pause on that slide, but I'll go to this one just in terms of the future work for the publication. Shivan has put into the chat the GitHub link. So if you want to actually engage there and open some issues, we'd be very, very appreciative. But yeah, I'm going to stay here on this slide while we have a chat, just because I think some of these are actually could be quite promising and certainly contributions to the space and the continuing debate. So I'll stop there. But Shivan, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I guess it was mentioned on the chat as well. Like, we are considering what would be a good venue. Like right now it's on GitHub. I guess because it's nice, kind of easy to get feedback from folks in terms of in the form of GitHub issues and stuff. But at some point we would like to move it to a more permanent form. Whether that's an internet draft or something else or a paper, we're not sure yet. But if people have opinions on what would be more useful, those are welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you both. And I hope people will agree. What caught my eye, to my mind, it raised all of the right questions, but in one place, which is really helpful. So it sort of helped to surface the challenges. The hard part's answering some of them, but I guess that's the whole point of asking them. So as always, if people want to raise their hand on Zoom, I see some already doing that, so I'll come on to you in a moment. And equally, anyone that can't, either can't for various technical reasons or doesn't immediately have that to hand, by all means just write a question in the chat and we can come on to those as well. We'll just take them sort of roughly in the order that they arose. So I think, Peter.
Can I just add one thing before you start in with questions, Andrew, that I forgot to mention, which is that it sparked my memory when you said all of these things are now in one place. There is a section that we want to write on accessibility, which I think is a really good point, because privacy, again, this is one of those like long debated things, that there are a lot of privacy and security related tools that make accessibility harder. There's an inherent tension in some of that, and it's just something we need to add. And we can explore more if folks don't obviously see that connection, but in case, go ahead. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's a very important point as well. So Peter first, then John, and then we'll see where the discussion takes us. So Peter, fire away.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks for this presentation. I have to say, I thought it was really thorough and touched on pretty much everything that I thought of in this on this subject. So thank you, Shivan and Mallory. I had a question though. When using the term DNS privacy, it felt a bit like it was just referring to DOE really, but I think there are some sort of, I saw briefly on the last slide that more nuanced distinction between DOE and DOT and other measures. But I felt like that was maybe something, have you been considering that?
Yeah, so the paper goes into a lot more depth and has the opportunity to cite the different things. So I think, and that's one of the overarching questions, I think, on almost all the slides was, what are these questions when you ask them of DOE versus DOT versus oblivious DOE versus, encrypted hello, all of these different things, I think they're either trying to solve some of these problems or they might actually be introducing new ones. And I think it actually might be useful at some point for us to get like just a matrix going and try to do some analysis. Although, green versus red is not very nuanced, but at least it would help sort of like track what are these different things. I think that would be, that would make the paper a lot better to be able to have some clarity around these approaches. And that's why we tried to keep it to DNS privacy, actually, and not try to, it's not a paper about DOE, it's, it's about all of it, so.
I guess I have one more question, if you don't mind. I was curious whether you had made any kind of progress on actually getting any kind of measurements.
Well, I mean, we're not actually doing that, but
okay.
One thing we thought about doing, like, just a whole paper on measurement only, and I think that actually might need to happen at the DNS privacy workshop. One of the half-day sections, if I'm not wrong, was on measurement alone. So certainly a lot of folks doing measurement in the public interest are able to use their tools. Both the measurement that I understood was happening was, existing measurement shifting to be able to work with the new private protocols. And then the other one is actually measuring things like who's blocking based on use of DOE, how is that actually changing the landscape for censorship? Because that's, a lot of what public interest is measuring. They want to know who's censoring what. And ironically, for a while, it was hard to measure that with DOE, but now that, the applets and so on embrace it, so yeah, I think we'd like to dig into that one particularly. And hopefully we could work with some of the leaders in, like IOTA and Censorship Planet or Censored Planet and, Uniprobe and that sort of thing. I think they'd all be interested. Hopefully we can reach out to them.
I think a major goal of the workshop, sorry, just to a clear point, goal of the workshop as well as this paper is to draw out what would be good areas of research and what would be good places to do measurement. So I think if there is something you think that is obviously like, okay, we clearly need research in this, then I think that would be like exactly what this paper is trying to achieve. So
yeah, and I know there were some papers at last ITF, I think in the IRTF sort of working groups on measurement, and there have been, I think, over the last few months as well. So there's some stuff coming to the fore on that, but clearly plenty of work still to be done as well. John has got his hand up next, so we'll come to John next, please. So John, fire away.
Yeah, John Todd from Quad 9. So thank you for the interesting paper. It hits on actually a lot of points that concern us also, that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. And one of the things I wanted to kind of ask you about is urgency, actually. There have been several discussions made about encryption of DNS as being simply one of a continuing stream of protocol enhancements that give additional privacy. And that is true. And that it won't have a significant effect in the long run. But I think your paper actually already talks about the fact that it seems to, where we're seeing entire shutdowns based on protocol. I would ask the question of, do you think that DNS encryption and the associated privacy and risks are more urgent or have the same urgency as prior protocol encryptions, because as they may be sort of the last unencrypted frontier or the last monitoring frontier, do they have an outsized effect where something like HTTPS previously had some or some significant effect, but it wasn't the last signal? Do you see DNS as the last signal, or is there yet another step in a progression towards throwing all the babies out with the bathwater, to use your phrase?
I mean, that's a really good question to point to future work. I think that's what we're trying to do in the last section. So maybe your reframing of it would be helpful for us to make that more clear about what we're trying to say. I think that the main point is that we have to look at this in terms of an ecosystem. It's not going to make sense to just take a slice and focus on DNS privacy anymore. Now that we've sort of done our best effort to look at all the different protocols at all the different layers and secure those up, now what's the low-hanging fruit now? And that does actually assume that it will become ubiquitous. It isn't yet. But once you assume ubiquity across all these different layers, then what are going to be the threats? What is going to be the new emerging threat? So that your guess is as good as mine, but we have to ask that question, because I think otherwise we're caught off guard with new and novel ways to do all kinds of nasty things. I mean, just to go backwards in time a little bit, I know this is a sort of closed conversation, but the thing that was really beautiful about TLS was domain fronting. I miss domain fronting. It was so easy, at least for, people using tools that needed to get around the sensors. It was just, it leveraged too big to block. It was like such a nice gift that the consolidators of the internet gave to the rest of us. And now it doesn't work anymore. And it hasn't worked for 3 years now or more. And I mean, that's just one example of like, if we had just thought of, and I think that some of these DNS privacy, efforts actually are trying to make up for domain fronting. I think they're a lot messier, and they might actually create more problems in the long run than just having domain fronting working would. But that's just like one example. So if we could have this paper ready like 3 years ago when domain fronting started getting shut off, maybe we could have influenced that, but we didn't know that then. But we shouldn't get surprised the next time around, I guess.
And I guess something that we've also been seeing, at least like in Pergy and like the IP address privacy workshop we did, is that, okay, so what happens after this? Now do we, if you are no longer blocking based on the domain name, are you going to start blocking an IP address? And what are the implications of consolidation on that? Because in that sense, like you might think that, okay, if everything is behind, like one consolidated player, then like it becomes a lot harder to block based on IP address. But if there's a one-to-one mapping between every single website and its IP address, then it's a lot easier. So maybe that's where we'll see the censorship, I guess, whole environment kind of shifting towards as a result of DNS encryption. But I guess we don't know yet. And there's a lot of research happening right now, like what the cardinality is and stuff of IP address to in terms of uniqueness. But yeah, I guess that's kind of like open question right now.
Yeah, well, and I would just, I guess, also push it back to you. And if you feel like there are things that we're missing that maybe are actually more important than DNS privacy now, and that this debate sort of brings this to light, definitely.
I think that there's been an analogy of DNS encryption being used as a weapon in war, right? The constant battle between privacy and unwanted interception. And we're now at kind of the A-bomb stage, and we're waiting for the hydrogen bomb in the other direction, which is not going to be good for anybody. But and I don't quite know how to stop the escalation. But yeah, there is a lot of discussion to be had there.
Yeah, there's a powerful analogy, I think, John, to be fair. Right, I got a couple of questions of my own, and I got one from the chat as well, and then I'll come to Ralph. So I'm just managing Ralph's expectations, probably a couple of minutes, Ralph and Chris. So a couple of, I think, easy ones from me. One is the whole thing about does encryption equal privacy anyway? Be interested to get your thoughts on that. And I'm mindful of a point that I think it was Vinny Parler from Cisco made in the ADD chat, which is with some of the protocols, I think DO being a case in point, where potentially you can multiplex different things in HTTPS, you might have the illusion of privacy. But in reality, there's a whole bunch of other stuff happening in parallel. So you've got no privacy whatsoever, which is worse to my mind than none, because if you think you're private and you're not, that's really, really bad. So just a question about, are we overplaying privacy or encryption as being the same as privacy when they're potentially quite different? And then sort of linked to that in a way. Contrasting the settings at operating system versus application sort of level, from an end user point of view, given that, as we know, most end users have never heard of DNS, don't understand it at all. Is there a risk by putting it into the application level that we're just creating a lot of fragmentation and confusion for users, and probably actually risking exporting a whole load more private data from the endpoint without their knowledge or meaningful ability to control it? So comments on either of those two, and then I'll read a question from the chat, and then we'll come on to Ralph and then Chris.
Cool. Please. Yeah, I'll do my best to answer at least two of those questions that I think I can remember. The first one is just about, are we overplaying it a bit? I think this always happens that, we're trying to speak to end users, which is a variety of people. Sometimes it's just individual users on their phones. Sometimes it's businesses and office administrators. I mean, there's just a whole bunch of people swept up in that term user. And anytime something great like this happens, we want to tell folks about it, but it's hard to do that. And it can often go wrong. So, still today, if you ask somebody, what does the private browsing button do on a browser, they won't be able to tell you properly, right? All it does is it just doesn't keep the record of that website on the browser itself, right? But it doesn't like do anything beyond that, right? So, or like, what was it called? Like ghost mode or something like that. Anyway, very misunderstood feature, right? So yeah, I think there's always a challenge in communicating why this particular thing keeps you safer than you were before. And that's just going to be a perennial problem. So I think we should always be careful to not oversell it and to always talk about the ways in which it can be misused or doesn't quite keep you as safe as you think you might be. Because, if you are on a public computer, you definitely want to be in private mode. You don't want the next person who sits at that computer to know where you were just then, right? But like that does not solve all of your problems in terms of privacy on the internet. This is also related to the second question, which is that I think that we need to be training users to understand where they're putting trust and when. And I think it would be incredibly difficult, a huge ask to think about DNS every time they downloaded a new app and hoping that that new app is going to have their best interests in terms of how it's doing its DNS resolution. I mean, hopefully it's just happening now, right? Like if you do it if like you are an app creator, you enable HTTPS, done. But probably in terms of being able to help users visualize and actually make an intentional choice about who they trust, you would want to put it just in the operating system so that it's sort of a one and done, right? And use DOT. But again, like somebody pointed out before, there was a way in which that this could have been done very, very quickly and efficiently to get as many users protected as possible. And then the sort of longer game, which is to actually do it the right way and sort of building out the ecosystem and doing it at the lower layers. And that's just, it would have been great if like operating systems had been as excited about this as the browsers, but they weren't at the time. And that also then I think speaks to the larger question around privacy as a business model means that everybody's going to be, well, not everybody, but there are going to be lots of people competing for users. And one of the ways they're going to be doing that is by telling them to trust them because they provide privacy. And so we will probably see a proliferation, which from a public interest perspective is not bad. But we need to think about how to message that to users.
Yeah, well, that's fair. Thank you. Anything to add, Shivan, before I ask the question from the chat?
I was going to say that it's interesting also. I think there was a paper about this as well at the DNS privacy workshop, but just the sense of like how different browsers, I guess specifically for Do, how they represent the secure DNS aspect in the settings page. And we've kind of had this discussion in the past where, like we tell the user that, oh, HTTPS means it's secure. And what that means is a green lock on the side of the Omnibox, as Chrome calls it, the URL bar, essentially, address bar. So could there be something similar to that that we could use for DNS? I don't know. I guess it's not really been done before. It's not like DNS is never like front and center to your browsing experience, whereas the URL or the address bar is. But could there be something like that which displays how secure your connection is and like all the issues that can come with that, right? Like because I guess yeah, okay, so what is the recursive to authoritative story then? How secure is that? So then, yeah, that's really complicated. I guess that's probably why we don't have that right now, but I think it's worth thinking through.
Yeah, and we've certainly had that discussion with some of the browser vendors as to whether there's something to do with the user interface. And I should say, before I go on to the question in the chat, that Tommy Jensen has rightly pointed out that, of course, there are operating system level implementations of DO as well as DOT, be that in Windows 10 or indeed in the various Apple operating systems now. Not sure about Android, confusingly, but certainly the other two main ones. The other question I had from the chat was, yeah, let me try and paraphrase this. So is there an issue about some of the perceived uplifts in privacy which are arguably being done in isolation and possibly without due consideration for the impact on other existing controls. So by improving one measure, it may actually be to the detriment of something else. And certainly one of the things I've seen in some of the working group discussions is remarkably little awareness in the different groups about what other groups are doing, or perhaps worse, what the operational sort of realities are. So for example, I know we had a discussion about same provider auto upgrade for encrypted DNS, which seems to be working okay in the US with the architecture common there, but I think none of the developers seem to be aware that it's a very different architecture that's common on broadband in Europe. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on how good the knowledge levels are about, yes, we improve measure A, but it might be to the detriment of existing measure B. So the net sort of change might be marginal, might even be negative sometimes. It's almost a statement as much as a question, but I don't know if there's anything you want to comment on that.
I mean, for things like that I would definitely have to look more into to increase my own expertise before I comment. It's certainly something that if it fits within the scope of the paper, we should look into, come up with good research questions for, so that either it's citing work that's been done on this, or at least it points to it. Because I think what we're aiming for with this paper is to be as well-rounded as possible in the sorts of tensions, and then to take not necessarily a stance, but to point in the right direction for how these tensions might be resolved from a public interest perspective. Like, yeah, for sure, there's going to be lots of legacy stuff that breaks. But once again, like, if you want to know what sort of would serve the public interest going forward, that's what we're trying to provide. Just like some guidance for, like, definitely don't just like hold on to your older stuff because it's easier for you. Like, try to take some action, and here's where we think actually is the right answer for that. But again, like, I'd appreciate capturing that somewhere in the notes so we can make sure to follow up.
Okay, yeah, good point. Thank you. Right, let's come on to Ralph and then Chris, and then I'll see if there are any other questions in the chat.
Yeah, so the question that I have is on trust, because I mean, how much can I trust the stuff that is running sort of today on my PC, or these things here on my network? And in the architecture we had before sort of those stuff, we had even in the old telco stuff, we had a signaling layer that decided where people would go. And then we had the actual data channel where people go. And I think this is also, if you say TLS connections to DNS connections. And with technologies now evolving, really trying to make sure that no one can intercept anything from a device that's running in my network, I'm actually kind of taking away the possibility to protect myself. And I've been doing internet stuff since '94. And I would say in today's internet, there's probably sort of the bad and the good. There's probably more bad than good out there. And I've worked with various organizations on Europe on kind of trying to block the bad stuff. And I've been running, so increased privacy for some people using really oblivious technology, you have to weigh that against kind of less security for larger people who who don't have the privacy problem because they live in jurisdictions where there are kind of protections for this.
Well, and I think what I'm hearing you say is, you know, if I'm running my home router, right, and I have just tons of IoT and lots of different people with their different devices on my network, used to be, you could go in and you could see what was going over your wire, and you could be like, wait a second, my toaster is making unauthorized requests to a domain that sounds really shady, and you could mitigate that. I think that DOE or DOT or whatever, it doesn't actually prevent you from doing that. I suspect that routers will now mitigate this by, again, doing, allowing you basically to intercept yourself. Right? So what these protocols do is they sort of cut off the low-hanging fruit for people who are sitting on the wire and shouldn't be looking at data that they shouldn't have access to. And it just raises the bar, but also creates an opportunity then to create tools either on your router or, you know, there are some of us that will go so far as to run our own resolvers, right? So that we can see what's happening. And then you still get that encryption all along the way.
So channel my inner Paul Vixie here. You cannot kind of intercept that in a way that is 100% safe like you could DNS traffic. It's just impossible. The only way you can do this is by decrypting all the stuff. And I don't think that is something where we want to go.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there are lots of different models for how to do it, but anyway.
Yeah, I think that also kind of goes into the abuse section, I guess, that we have over here, like the tension between privacy and abuse. Yeah, I guess like, I don't know if we have something there right now that talks about like your personal use case, like if I want to do this, then how does that work out? And like, you know, if the user has their own threat model and they want to work with that, and they've thought about mechanisms to do that, then how does DNS encryption play into that? Yeah, I don't think we have anything on that right now.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ralph. And I suppose that does beg the question. Be interesting to see, and maybe this might be a question for the final paper, whether the worst transgressions on privacy are at the endpoint or on the wire. Because I'm more nervous about the endpoint than the wire, but I appreciate that other people have a different view on that.
Well, and certainly I think we always have to, I mean, I do get the tendency to feel like security is a really big problem and it's never going to fully be solved and it feels a little defeatist, but I think we have to resist that urge because DNS privacy is solving a huge, massive gaping hole that was open for a really long time. So we have to be able to do all the things and create the trade-offs. And that's all we're trying to do, right? Is document what are those trade-offs so that we can do all the things without just not fixing the DNS, because that doesn't seem like an option.
Yeah, that's a fair comment. Right, we've got last two questions. There are some comments on the chat, but I'll share those afterwards in the interest of time. So Chris first and then Jim.
Hello. Very useful talk, by the way. Find it really useful. My question is very similar to what Ralph was covering. So it is on privacy versus abuse and that tension there. You mentioned that there is a line to be drawn, and people draw that line in different places. But is there therefore some consensus that the line sits somewhere, and therefore there is a space on one side of the line that we consider to be abuse and that we want to do something about? If there is that consensus, I guess the challenge is, well, how do we define some technologies that allow us to manage that abuse? So it's, if in terms of the trend, the way the protocol design is going, you know, it's going towards maximizing privacy, which brings lots of benefits, but it brings with it the risk of just losing all control of that abuse section, whatever size it is. So I think I mean, thanks for the link to the paper. It's the last sentence in the privacy versus abuse section is more work should be done to scope DNS privacy compatible abuse mitigation. So does that mean this is also an area for which you don't have the answer either, but we need to work on it?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's right. I mean, just going back to what we were saying in the previous the question and what came out of it, like, certainly there are ways to, you know, intercept yourself. I think the point is really well made that, like, if you're going to now intercept all HTTPS traffic, let's say you're an enterprise, right? I think it'd be perfectly fine if I were a homeowner and all the network on my traffic, I could do what I want with it. But if you're maybe an employee at a company that is needing to monitor what's going on for a variety of totally legitimate reasons, maybe there's a best practice in there somewhere. Maybe there's a gap where, you know, privacy advocates could help you intercept all of the DNS traffic, decrypt it, but not such that you're decrypting everything and not such that you're peeking too far into what everyone else is doing. There's certainly ways to do that. So there's a gap, right? There's a gap in a sort of, here's how you can, get the same sorts of, access to the DNS as it was going over your wire before, but now with privacy involved and, the same effect. So, but it's a really important point, which is why, of course, we included it in the paper.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Jim?
Thanks, Andrew. I'm kind of a little bit concerned about what Mallory just said there. You're kind of saying that it's being only a little bit pregnant. And I think Ralph captured the comments a little bit earlier fairly succinctly. If we're going to start intercepting encrypted HTTPS traffic, that's a very bad privacy outcome, no matter how well intentioned those efforts are. And I think it's naive to think you could have a scenario where you could intercept some HTTPS traffic, but not other traffic. Or you would only look at the DNS data and not look at the other stuff. I think that's very, very, very unlikely. And the problem you've got there is that the juicy stuff, in my opinion, is going to be in the rest of that HTTPS traffic, credit card details, logins and passwords, all that kind of stuff, not so much the DNS queries. So the idea we could have a code of conduct or some kind of best practices document that's saying, well, don't do that. That strikes to me as a good thing, as things like giving people guns and say, don't shoot people with them. It's just not going to happen. I'm sorry, Mallory, I have to disagree with what you said.
I think you would misunderstand me, Jim, because what I'm trying to say is that if we can break this down for folks who would like to continue to have access to plain text DNS data, that would be a helpful argument to make. Like, look, unless you want to be liable for snooping on everyone's credit card details and their login information, perhaps don't do it. And the thing that you're really searching for, the thing that you really want to do, that you could previously have done with just snooping on people's DNS data, perhaps there's a different way to do that. Maybe you need to look elsewhere because this is no longer accessible to you. But it's important for the privacy of the users on your network, the employees that you have, to not touch it. I think a document that lays that out is what's needed, not a judgment one way or another. I don't necessarily think that, I'm certainly not going to snoop on my own DNS traffic. I don't have a lot of IoT devices, but I'm also sensitive to the fact that for some setups, that's a real thing. And we're not going to fix it by ignoring it, which is the point of the paper. We're trying to confront the tensions so that we can come up with some nuanced guidance about what to do from a public interest perspective. I certainly don't want to ignore any of the concerns that have been raised.
Always good to have a reference to the use of guns somewhere in the conversation just to spice up things. Can I just ask maybe one final point, and we should be really brief as we are over time, so apologies everyone. Did you observe any differences in perspective between the US and Europe? Because I know Chris touched on earlier about where, if there's agreement, where the line is. I suspect there probably isn't agreement between the US and Europe, but I don't want to preempt that. So did you get a completely different point of view depending on which continent you looked on between those two?
I'm aware of the different approach to the use of DNS to do filtering and blocking, but I suppose there are gradients of it. I think in terms of regulatory environments or the openness of the internet, I set my sights a lot higher on China and Russia and Iran than I would on the UK, even though by some measure, the UK is right up there in terms of the number of URLs that are on filter lists. That's not the concern. I think it's also quality over quantity, or the purposes of it. For the most part, we can trust democratic governments to not filter out, sites put up by social movements for a while, right? But that's different than it is in China. But then there are other things that are filtered and blocked that, depending on social norms and laws, wouldn't be filtered and blocked elsewhere. So yeah, certainly there are gradients. It's more, I think, for the purposes of this paper, useful to look at it from a, I guess, a technical perspective rather than focus on the content.
Thank you. Right, any last words either of you wish to share at all?
Well, just thanks very much for the conversation. I'm hoping that we can get a readout of the recording or the notes or something, so because I think there were some good suggestions for things that we need to smooth out when we're trying to look through these tensions. But also don't hesitate to take the same questions you asked here into GitHub if you'd like to have the conversation there. We'd appreciate it. Shivan?
Yeah,
Thank
yeah, thank you for having us. And we got a bunch of comments from the workshop as well. And I guess we kind of have to find the time to kind of look at both those notes from today and that time and kind of incorporate that into the paper.
Perfect. In which case, thanks both for your time, and I hope for everybody else you appreciated it did raise a lot of very interesting questions in the paper. So I'd urge you all to have a look at the paper, look at the slides, look at GitHub, put some pull requests in, etc. And hopefully the discussion will continue. This won't be an easy one to crack, I don't think, but it's an important discussion that needs to be had. So with that note, thanks everyone for your time, and I'll put the links to the recording out later on today, and have a great week, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Bye.